This is the Read, Write, and Create podcast, the award-winning podcast where you get a bite-sized session of creative writing coaching from me, Lori L. Tharps. I'm a journalist and a former tenured college professor who moved to the south of Spain so I could live a global literary life. I'm also an award-winning author of both fiction and nonfiction who believes in the transformative power of a story well told. I created this podcast because I want to help as many BIPOC writers as possible get their stories out of their heads and into the world. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello, wordsmiths, storytellers, and scribes. I am back with another exciting episode for our special Behind the Book season of the podcast. Remember, instead of speaking with legendary authors, this season we will be speaking to people who work in the book business. People whose livelihoods depend on the free-flowing circulation of books in the world. People like today's guest, Stephanie Lim. Stephanie is a publisher and co-founder of Third State Books. She is a former marketing executive who brings an abiding love of literary classics, guilty pleasure genre fiction, fanfic, and children's books to her work at Third State Books. Stephanie spent over 15 years in digital marketing and operations, first as a strategist for advertising clients at Google, then leading e-commerce teams and managing multi-million-dollar advertising budgets for retail brands such as ModCloth, Bebe, and Serena Williams' eponymous fashion label. Early in her career, she shifted through slush piles as an intern at Penguin Putnam and edited a mathematical children's book for Charles Bridge Publishing. Stephanie will always be a Southern California girl at heart, but she's making the best of the perpetually foggy weather in San Francisco with her husband and their 2 sons. I am delighted to have had the opportunity to sit down with Stephanie for her to tell me all about her experience launching a publishing company in 2023 that is specifically aimed at publishing books by Asian American authors. This conversation gets a little personal. The conversation gets very public, and we talk about everything from why Stephanie and her co-founder founded this company, what kind of books they are publishing, the challenges of publishing books specifically by Asian Americans for Asian Americans, but are also interested in going wide. And we talk about why Stephanie believes that we need more books where Asian Americans get to play the starring roles. It's a great conversation. I know you're going to learn a lot. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Read, Write, and Create podcast, Stephanie. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to chat with you, Lori.
Well, I have to tell everybody, I was very excited when I heard about Third State Books, and I honestly don't remember even how I first heard about it. I think I just stumbled upon the company, some research I was doing on the internet. And so for this Behind the Book season of the podcast, I thought, wow, this would be a great time to introduce our listeners to Third State Books. But before we get to your company, I would like to know a little bit more about you, Stephanie. And the first question that we ask all of our guests for this season is, why do you think books are so important in society?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts about that, but they shape pretty much everything in our culture, our collective consciousness. You know, we talk a lot on our team about how the real white supremacy isn't the KKK. It's like the New York Times, it's the Big Five, it's the New Yorker, it's all these cultural institutions that are controlled by a very tiny minority of the populace. It's not just white. It's actually a very privileged, legacied. They've been doing it for generations, kind of upper echelon of elite society. And it only makes room for stories that they deem are worth telling. When 85 to 95% of the traditional publishing industry is white from every level, you have to ask A, what are the stories that are not being told? B, of the stories that are being told, how are they being shaped by that perspective?
Right. And so the culture that we consider mainstream culture or American culture, it's not really. It's like you're saying, it's the culture that has been created by this very specific group of people, their perspective, which leaves so many people out. And then we have books written by non-white people to push against what I consider a false narrative that is white supremacy.
Right? It's like one perspective that just does not capture the reality, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you tell our listeners, how did you come into launching or co-launching Third State Books when I know you have a background in e-commerce and fashion and that you worked with Serena Williams on her fashion line? So can you kind of paint the picture of your journey from e-commerce, fashion to launching Third State Books?
I don't know if you caught that in the very beginning of my career, when I was actually still a college student 20 years ago, I was an intern at Penguin Putnam for a summer. I also did a year at Charles Bridge Publishing, which is a small educational imprint in Boston. And I spent an entire year there. I completely rewrote, storyboarded, chose the artist, saw a picture book from start to finish while I was there. And so I think the story of Third State really begins with the story of how I did not enter the publishing industry upon graduation. Quite frankly, what it would have taken would be moving to New York City, which is, as we know, a very expensive city, making $26,000 a year, which is entry level at the time for editorial assistants, having no family, no network there, and, living in Brooklyn with 6 roommates. And I just wasn't prepared to do that because I grew up in Southern California. And so the people who can afford to do that are really legacy people who have possibly trust funds, possibly parents that are supporting their lifestyle as they, live in a brownstone in Chelsea or something like that. So instead, I chose to move back to Southern California where my family was. I asked myself, what is work that I could do that's similar? Because I really loved the work. I loved working with stories. I loved working with writers. And the industry that kind of segued into that is Hollywood and film development. So I actually spent a couple of years in film development in Southern California because I was living in LA and I could at least go home and do laundry on the weekends and tutor kids from my high school to make ends meet. And the work was actually very similar in its story development with this kind of weird networking layered on. My first job out of college was actually as a film development assistant with Forrest Whitaker's production company. It's dead now. It was before he connected with Nina Yang. It was called Spirit Dance Entertainment. So I spent a year there, and then I spent a year at a comedy producers company, Bob Simon's. And at the time, it was 2005. Streaming was just starting. Everyone's freaking out, oh my God, the internet's gonna destroy Hollywood. And it's funny because it kind of came true, but it took about 20 years for it to kind of play out. And at the time I was well, I could slog it out for another 10, 15 years. And some of my peers still are there. Actually, one of my friends is now an agent that we work with on Third State properties. But at the time I was I could slug it out for another 10, 15 years. It's a very cutthroat business. The risk just increases as you grow because there's just fewer jobs at the higher executive levels. And I was you know what? I'm not sure if this is really worth dedicating the next 10, 15 years. And that's when I made the left turn into e-commerce and digital marketing. So I was I'm going to go see what this internet thing's all about. And I moved up to the Bay Area to work at Google, actually. And that was my first job in tech. And then I moved quickly into e-commerce and digital marketing for retail specifically. So that's what I spent the last 10, 15 years doing. And then I had kids and then realized, how many dresses does a woman really need when I'm wearing what I call potato sack dresses now as a mom. I just couldn't be bothered for, with young children. So at the time I was really having a kind of come to Jesus moment about how do I justify staying in this industry that's extremely exploitative, both of the environment, the other countries, industries, etc. So I started doing a little soul searching and taking informational interviews with people I knew in different industries and, kind of literally made like a bubble map of different interests I had, either work related or hobby related, and then people I could talk to in each of those domains. One of those people was this woman, Ellie Yang Camp, that I knew socially from church, actually. And my co-founder was her agent. So she had gotten a deal with Heyday Books, writing a book about, at the time it was supposed to be a YA, Asian American history through the lens of, I think, white supremacy. And it kind of morphed into something else, but it's called Louder Than the Lies. It came out last fall. Anyway, so she put me in touch with Charles, my co-founder, and we started ideating what we call in Silicon Valley founder dating, which is like meeting on a regular basis. It's a thing. It is. Founder dating where you like meet on a regular basis and talk about vision, mission. We even asked ourselves, like, is this a nonprofit or not? And we, do we like incorporate as a nonprofit or as a for-profit business? And we felt strongly that we needed to make the point that Asian American stories had an audience, has a market, and could be like profitable. That it wasn't like quote unquote charity to invest in Asian American stories. My husband actually suggested that we incorporate as what's called a public benefit corporation, which means that we are tied to both financial returns, but also a mission.
So I'm just curious, what kind of background did your co-founder, Charles, have?
So he actually is one of the few that slogged it out for 30 years before we started this company. So he has been an editor, an agent. He worked at the MoMA as an editorial director. And then right before we launched Third State, he was working at Serendipity Literary Agency, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Yeah, I just interviewed Regina yesterday.
So yeah. Oh, yesterday? That's so funny. So Regina has long been his mentor. I think he spent almost 10 years there. She is also, we list her as one of our advisors on our website. And as you know, she is just, a legend in the space and a pioneer. Yeah, so he was on her team. And so he brings to this a wealth of, like just how things are done. And a lot of the quote unquote founder dating that we were doing was like him kind of explaining how things worked and me going like, why? Like what? Just poking at all of these things that seem so nonsensical to somebody coming from, especially like, tech and Silicon Valley, where everything's about quote unquote disruption and we're going to disrupt this industry, right? Like, it's just, but part of that mentality is not taking things for granted, asking, is there a better way?
I love that. So first question, why Third State Books? Where did that title come from?
We kicked around a lot of different name ideas, and some of them were very on the nose and kind of corny, like, I don't know, Golden State, but I don't know, like Golden Gate, I don't know, Angel, I don't know, still a bunch of stuff. But there's this concept of like this third place or third culture, this concept of like not feeling, it's like the immigrant's dilemma of like not feeling quite at home in the home country and not feeling at home in the adopted country and kind of lingering in this limbo in between. I am not recalling the name of the French Algerian philosopher that my co-founder loves to quote, who first kind of codified this concept. He wrote it as kind of a negative thing. And we felt like we wanted to reclaim that space as something really special and something unique to our experience of like kind of being in between and being a bridge between two cultures. So it's like very similar to like the concept of third culture. We just like the name state, but like the word state just rolled off the tongue a little better.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, like from third culture kids. Now, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about, on this podcast, we say this is a podcast for BIPOC writers. A lot of people kind of talk generally like BIPOC authors, but a lot of times they mean Black authors. Or, they have to be very specific if you're talking about Asian American authors or Indigenous authors or even Latino authors. So I would like to know if you could kind of share what was the impetus for this creation of this publishing company. In other words, what did you see in the landscape for Asian American authors that you thought this is necessary?
So it's funny because someone asked me, like, are we included as BIPOC, like as Asian Americans? And I think that question even came up is indicative of our specific dilemma as Asian Americans, which is that we're kind of in the in-between, because like in some aspects, a lot of people argue that we are like white adjacent. And we do, like I have to say, like we have a certain privilege when we walk out into the world that is not the same as what brown and black folks have to deal with every day. And on the other hand, we're not actually accepted by the white majority. It's like we're leveraged conveniently for things like affirmative action. But when it comes to like true acceptance, we're not included. We're not part of the room. We're not part of the discussion. We don't have a real seat at the table in the same way that other BIPOC folks do. So like we have this like interesting kind of in-between dilemma, I think, as a group, as a community. You were asking about the landscape of where we stand in literature. I think it's similarly, when we look at total numbers, Asian Americans are about 7% and growing, like one of the fastest growing groups in the US. And if you looked at the number of books published by Asian American authors in the last few years, it's roughly the same. It's about 7%. So it's not necessarily like from a total numbers perspective, an issue of lack of representation. I think it's like much worse for other groups like Latin Americans, for instance, in terms of like proportion of the population. But if you dig down, there are so many like both Latinx and Black focused publishing houses and imprints that are like focused on those groups. There's something like, 120 something. And Black Americans are, let's say, 15% of the population. So proportionally, there should be 60 or so Asian American imprints, and there was none. Not focused specifically on Asian American. There are others like Kaya Press who they cover stories of the Asian diaspora, but they do a lot of, I think, translations from Asia into the US. That's like one of their things that they do. And we specifically were like, that's a very different perspective. Somebody who grew up in Asia just doesn't understand the struggle of what it's like to like grow up having your lunch made fun of, or your like name mispronounced, or you're like, Ching Chong Chinaman, whatever, right? So it's just a different perspective. So we really like our very clear line of the sand of who we represent is like anybody of Asian heritage, which is like very broad for us. It could be anything from the Middle East or what you could call West Asia to the Pacific Islands, in theory. We just started publishing our first books last year. So it's going to take us some time to get to a full representation of the whole diaspora. But in theory, that's what we're aiming for. And then America, we kind of think of as like New World. So anywhere from Alaska and Nova Scotia all the way down to the tip of South America. So I feel like that's pretty broad, but I think the important thing is that it's like somebody from a immigrant perspective or children of immigrants or somewhere in between. So if you have fairly good representation in terms of number of books published, but then you have basically an Asian or any BIPOC writer plugging into a system where, again, like every touch point is white dominated. So it's like their agent might be white, their editor is white, the entire marketing and publicity team, the people who pull the purse strings, who are like, this book gets all the marketing love for this season and is like one of our marquee titles versus like everybody else is left to flounder and pay for their own book tours. Those people are all majority white. And so you end up with stories that go through this filter like, oh, this is really interesting perspective, but maybe if you like tone down this piece of your culture or, maybe you emphasize this because it's so fascinating. And so like, like that's what ends up happening. It's the devil's in the details. And so, one like concrete example I can give from a book that we published last year, Pride and Preston Lynn, which is it's a fluffy, fun Jane Austen remake, right? It's not on the surface supposed to be serious, but even a line like, I think she had a line in there that was like, takes place in the competitive swim world. So it's like, oh, isn't it so hard to coach Asian kids because the parents are so intense? And I'm like, have you met crazy white sports parents? Like, they're just as good. Like, you can't have this line in here. Like, that's a line where a white editor will probably not even pay attention. And for me, I was like, as third state books, we are not perpetuating this, like, tiger parent fallacy in our book. So I was like, I've had her change it to, like, Silicon Valley parents, which is absolutely true. There's, like, everybody wants their kid to get into Stanford in Silicon Valley. But it's not necessarily specific to Asians,
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about whether you think of third state books as, when you were conceiving of this idea, was it like, we want Asian American authors to have a home that represents them well? Or did you think Asian American readers deserve a publisher that is thinking of them and their needs and the types of books that they deserve to have?
I think it's both. On the author side, I'll give you an example. Our author, Ansoon Choi, who we just released this book, LA Coroner, in April. And it's about Thomas Noguchi, this man who served as the LA County Chief Medical Examiner from the early 60s to the early 80s. His first autopsy was Marilyn Monroe. And he did RFK's autopsy. He did all the Manson murder victims, Natalie Wood. He's basically like, we joke, he's like the Forrest Gump of forensics because he touched so many iconic cases. So Anne had brought this book to a number of Big Five publishers, and she actually got a couple of offers, I believe. But the editors there were like, this is all very interesting, but could we maybe like focus on the celebrity death angle, which is like so titillating, the white celebrities, right? And maybe downplay this like Asian American dude. She was like, absolutely not. Because the whole point of her writing this book was to center Thomas Noguchi as a character, the main character of this story. Because he himself was like such an interesting guy. He was a post-World War II, they call him Shin Issei, the Japanese who came over after the war, and were not interned. So he had none of the baggage of all these people coming out of internment. And so he was like very audacious in how he approached his work and how public he was about it. Like nobody could name a coroner unless you work in that field, right? But Thomas Noguchi's name was regularly like in the LA Times, and he would hold these like crazy press conferences going into lurid detail about these cases that eventually got him into trouble and like got him removed from office. So yeah, fascinating guy. And, these white editors are like, let's focus on the thing that's going to sell, which is like Marilyn Monroe. So Anne brought this, Anne's agent actually, he was literally like, I think the second cold email that came into our general hello at Third State Books after we launched in Publishers Weekly. And we were like, wait, this is an incredible story. And so, yeah, we made that deal happen. Anne felt comfortable saying yes to us because she knew that we would allow her to center the right person in that story. So that's like from an author perspective. From a reader perspective, yes, when the traditional publishing industry envisions their ideal or what they call mainstream reader, it's not a 13-year-old Filipina in San Jose or a parachute kid from Beijing, going to Stuyvesant in New York. It's a middle-aged white lady in Kenosha, Wisconsin, reading Crazy Rich Asians with her book club. And that's who everything is geared toward, this quote-unquote average mainstream reader. But it does not take into account any of the rest of us. So, taking Pride and Preston Lynn as an example, the way that she paints the Bay Area and these characters are getting boba on Castro Street and Mountain View, which is literally what I spent most of my 20s doing because I lived in that area. And it's just my lived experience.
So I want to know if you could tell us a little bit about the challenges of launching a publishing house in, was it 2023 that you officially
So
opened,
we officially launched with an article in Publishers Weekly in 2023 and spent, all of that year developing our slate. And then our first books started releasing in 2024. Yes.
Yeah. So what are the kind of challenges, kind of big picture challenges? I mean, I know it must be every day must be
the
a
fact
challenge.
that people don't read that much anymore, that's a challenge. I think that's something that's facing the entire industry, and that the only books that are flourishing are, your TikTok books and your dark romanticities and whatnot, right? Which is why I'd say, my approach to this publishing company, I think the other piece that I didn't mention about kind of the landscape of Asian American writing, I think, is that it has traditionally or historically been very focused on literary and prestige. So you have a lot of authors who have been very well recognized by the National Book Award, the Pulitzer. I just remember when Jhumpa Lahiri won the Pulitzer at age 28. That was 20 years ago, I think. And when I thought about it, I'm like, it's kind of a extension of this, like, going back to the tiger parent idea, like this drive that we have sometimes to have that stamp on the forehead, that Ivy League degree, that like validation. But like, who is doing the validating? It's this white supremacist system that we're buying into. And so for me, I'm very open about the fact that I'm like quite commercial in my taste. As a mom, a friend of mine got me into fanfic and literally nursing my kids and like reading like, Harry Potter fanfic on my phone. And it's like for the people, and some of it is way better than what is put out by the traditional publishing industry. And I'm all about that. I'm like, we need less trauma stories. I mean, yes, those are also very important. Very important. But you don't know how many, in the beginning especially, we got pitched so many, like, people made fun of me for my lunch or like, can't pronounce my name type of stories. And we're like, no, I want to see Asian joy, right? Like, you want to see Black excellence. I want to see Asian excellence. I want to see stories where our kids can just be themselves. They can be the adventurers, the pirates, the astronauts, and they just happen to be Asian. But like, it's not about like, oh, my identity and my like, what is it, like pickled monkey paws in a jar, like with Maxine Hong Kingston, how she described some of her upbringing. Like, this doesn't have to be such a razor focus on what makes us different.
I'm curious, like, you said one of the big challenges is like people don't read, but what do you do for marketing? Like, what do you do to get the words out about your books? Like, how are you looking to market or publicize the books that Third State is publishing?
Frankly, we are still figuring this out as we go, right? We're not profitable yet. It's only been a year. And what I realized about the traditional publishing industry is that it's very like hits driven. It's actually very similar to the venture capital world where they throw money at like 100 things and they expect maybe 80 to 90% of those fail. Some of those might break even, and then 2 to 4 will become what they call unicorns. And in the book world, this would be the equivalent of like a Harry Potter or like a Court of Thorns and Roses, where like literally that series probably pays for everything else. It pays for the poetry and the and the Pulitzer winners, and like it pays for all of that. And just starting out, we don't have a backlist because if you think about it, like Hachette or Grand Central, they own the rights to Kill a Mockingbird, and I think it still sold something like 1 million copies last year. So it's like that's what's paying for everything else. And we don't have that luxury right now. So we actually do need a hit. And I have like high hopes about a couple of the titles that we have coming up this fall. But I'm realizing that that's kind of like how the economics of publishing works. I mean, we went into it like really wanting to give each title a really fair shot. I think a lot of it is that I have to give our hats off to our distributor Ingram, which has like the access and the reach across Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all the bookstores, right? And then on top of that, we always went in knowing that we were going to take the best that we could of like traditional publishing, like, taking ads out in the trades, getting reviews, like all that, but also at the same time hitting that like Asian American core through like, we have a partnership with Next Shark, which is one of the biggest sources of news for Asian American news online. And we're very like mindful of working in concert with a lot of the groups that are active in the Asian American space. So like our first book, Fighting to Belong, which is a graphic novel aimed towards middle grade readers that teaches AAPI history. This was actually an idea brought to us by the Asian American Foundation. And like let's just say they're very well resourced. It was their idea because they had, I think, printed a couple thousand copies that were just sitting in the CEO's garage, and they were just handing them out at their events. And we're like, no, we need to get these into libraries and schools. And so we brought the distribution. So we arranged like a co-publishing agreement with them. But they have, they just had their summit in May, and they had Lucy Liu was a guest panelist at they're very well connected in the Asian American space.
That brings me to my this is the question I've been asking everybody as we wind down, is for everybody listening, what would you say would be the best thing that they could do to help support Third State Books? How they can make sure that Third State Books grows into its potential?
I guess the very base level is supporting by reading, by buying our books. But then on top of that, I didn't realize going into this how much, I guess, weight are carried by certain gatekeepers in the book industry, like librarians, educators, book buyers. And so even almost more effective than buying the book outright is like going into, let's say, your local library and requesting that they carry XYZ book. And this is true of supporting not just us, but any independent or BIPOC writer, I think, is by going into your library and asking for it, going into the local bookstore and asking for it, talking about it online, just like amplifying the message and I guess just evangelizing is kind of, the best term I can think of for it. And also, so much of the way that we're having this conversation now is like kind of helping people reorient their thinking around, like you said, why books are so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to stand by my book writers. I'm standing biased. But I think the last thing that I wanted to ask you, Stephanie, is what do you think is the misconception about Asian American stories? I've been in this business for a super long time as well as a books reporter. I've covered the book industry for a really long time. And I just know that in general, historically speaking, people generally think that stories about Asian people are foreign stories. That's the narrative that people have. And so I'm wondering.
I know exactly what I'm going to say, which is
yes.
I think I've really given this a lot of thought in the last, year and a half. But more and more, I'm convinced that the central issue, I guess, that's unique to Asian American, not just stories, but just our community in general, is invisibility. I really think that that's it, right? Because especially if you look at the history of race in America, it has always been couched in terms of black and white. And there's just no room in the discourse for the in-between. And so what we've struggled with, I think, as a people is always getting sidelined. We just did a recent post on our Instagram about this, which is that we are so used as a people of being sidelined and made supporting characters in this narrative that we don't even see ourselves as the main character anymore. It's literally we've internalized this idea of being the side characters for at least the last several decades. And it's so when I talk to people, I'm you deserve to have your story told. You deserve to be the main character. It just, that main character energy is something that I so deeply want everyone I talk to inhabit. Truly. That's the thing that I think our community struggles with the most.
As a journalism professor, I taught a class on ethnic media, and that was the issue when we studied the media of different ethnic groups in the United States. And when we got to Asian American media, it was invisibility. And that was literally the thing. It was the lack of visibility on Asian American issues and communities made it that much harder to know those communities, to help them, that you never saw the problems, you didn't have the voices. So in some ways, it was a protection because it was nobody's bothering us. But at the same time, nobody was helping us. Nobody was hearing us. Nobody was seeing us. And so media was used, people of Asian descent creating media outlets because we needed some way
again,
to be
going
seen
back
and heard.
to the story of Thomas Noguchi, where he himself was putting himself out there. He understood the power of press and publicity. So he would call his own press conferences and own the narrative before other people got to control the narrative of the cases he was working on. So he was very savvy about that. But even now, there was, I think, a documentary on Marilyn Monroe's death, and he wasn't mentioned at all. It's crazy, right? He has been just completely written out of the histories, which is why we are no, we're going to put him back on the map. There was actually a TV show, a very a primetime TV show that ran from the 70s to the early 80s called Quincy M.E., starring Jack Klugman. that
Love
was
that show.
based on Noguchi's career.
No way.
Yes. And of course they like cast a white dude. And you know what they did? They cast a Japanese American as his assistant, as a nod to Noguchi.
No.
Yes.
I used to watch that show
Oh
because
my
my
gosh.
mom's name is Quincy.
No, that's so funny.
And everybody call her Dr. Quincy. We
Yeah.
love that show.
That show was based on Noguchi's career.
You have just changed my life. Like,
What?
that's
We'll have
crazy.
to send you a copy of it.
Oh my God, yes. That's fascinating piece of information. But again, it goes to show we as people of color in the United States have to write ourselves into history because we've been written out. And nobody's going to write us back
No
in
one is
except
going
ourselves.
to. Like, I'm sorry, but the dominant culture does not give a shit about us. Like, they just, I mean, you know, there's allies, but like I'm saying the power structures is what I mean. The power structures, they don't care about us.
No, and the fact that Quincy was a white man, like they knew that was a fascinating story and they literally put a white man. That's just kind of exemplary of why we need to do what we do. Because they will just put a white, they'll take your story.
And you better believe we optioned the rights to LA Coroner. So we would love to see this adapted in true form with an Asian American lead as the main character.
I like that main character energy. That's what Stephanie Lim and the people at Third State Books are trying to do. Main character energy. I love that. That's what I'm going to name this episode. Main character energy.
Oh, good. Yes, I feel like that's been the theme of our year.
Well, I want to just thank you for doing this work, Stephanie, and I'm excited for Third State Books. I hope that it continues to flourish and grow. You guys get your backlist and you get your unicorn, your literary unicorn. Before I let you really go, though, I have to ask, what is the last book that you read that you really enjoyed?
It's so funny because I was going through my Libby account and I was like, oh, I've been reading a lot of white fantasy authors recently. So I'm not going to mention those, but I'd say that actually Yellowface was a really interesting one recently. That it's so funny because like, I do not know R.F. Kuang at all, like personally, but you kind of love to hate her because she's like so gorgeous and so talented. And you're like, ugh. And I like went into it being like, I'm going to hate this, but she did an amazing job, I think, of like capturing the publishing industry and all those like the microaggressions, the like rationalization and, the white character and like how she truly like kind of convinced herself that she was doing the right thing. It's so interesting how she dove into that psychology.
I loved that book. And we actually read it in our writing community. I actually assigned it as our book club to talk about the industry, right? Not necessarily on the merits of the book. I thought the book was hilarious. I enjoyed the read very much, but I thought she did such a good job of lambasting the publishing industry and bringing out so much.
It's so interesting how the industry embraced that narrative. It's almost like, haha, look at how like awful we are. And we're going to get away with it. We're going to keep getting away with it. Like, it's kind of like how, it's so funny because like, I kind of think about like, my white friends love stories like White Lotus or like Succession that are about like awful people, right? Like there's no redeeming character in that like first season. And I'm just like, I can't relate. I can't relate because like, I don't know. I guess that's like a position of privilege to be able to look at a story and be like, oh, these people are so awful. But like, it's so enjoyable to watch awful people on the screen. I can't relate because I want to see somebody that I can root for. You can only do that when you come from a position of power. You can only embrace a narrative that shows how shitty you are if you are actually calling the shots.
Yeah. Yellowface and the movie American Fiction. I think both of those together do a really good job of making fun of and yet also being a mainstream success. Anyway, okay, I'm going to let you go, Stephanie. Thank you so, so much. But you just tell people where they can find Third State Books?
We're at Third State Books on Instagram is probably where we update the most. But we are technically on X and Facebook.
And your books are distributed all over?
Wherever books are sold. You know that term? That's what distribution does. So wherever books are sold. I mean, even if they're not stocking, you can always go in and ask them to order the book.
And what are maybe your next two books coming out that people should be looking for?
In August, we have a picture book called Tic-Tac-Toe Chicken, which is a adorable story about a real-life chicken It lived in this arcade in Mott Street in New York City, Chinatown, and it was taught to play tic-tac-toe against customers. And it's about a fictional girl who is playing against the chicken to win its freedom, which is so sweet, I thought. And then the next book after that is a middle grade novel by Abigail Hing Wen. She is a New York Times best-selling YA author. She wrote Love Boat Taipei and was adapted to Love in Taipei on Netflix, actually. We're publishing her book, The Veil, she wrote it 10 years ago, and it's actually about a little boy who uses AI generation to create a Minecraft-like world. It's kind of like Ready Player One meets Chronicles of Narnia. She did not use AI to write the book, but it's an exploration, I think, of the opportunities and the pitfalls of this technology. And it's funny that she wrote it 10 years ago. Her agents and her editors were like, what the hell is AI generation? There's no market for this. Because it's in 2015. And then lo and behold, when I reconnected with her and she was like, I have this manuscript that I've just been sitting on. And I was like, yes, give it to me. Even though I don't think we could have, there's no way we would have been able to afford a writer like Abigail because of, we're a startup. We just can't compete with like your typical auction. But she believed in our vision and our mission, and she understood what it meant to work with us. And then, one more. In November, we have another true crime by Tin Ho, who is the current DA of Sacramento. And he was the main prosecutor against the Golden State Killer. Joseph D'Angelo? Yeah.
Well, we'll put all of those links in the show notes, and obviously links to the Third State Books website as well, and the social media handles. Stephanie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Lori.
Wishing you all the best.
You too.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I learned so much from Stephanie about really what it takes to bring a book to market. What is it like to start a publishing company in the 21st century? I really hope you all learned as much as I did. And I'm not suggesting that everyone go and start their own publishing company, but I am really hopeful that people take heart and take inspiration from Stephanie and her co-founders' decision to, rather than watch their culture and their people and their stories be erased or ignored, to say, hey, we'll do it ourselves. We can all, I think, take that approach and take that energy to make sure that our stories are not being erased, they're not being ignored, and we have the ability and the right to make sure our stories get told, whether that's as a writer or, somebody playing on the other side of the fence to just make sure these stories get into the right hands. And again, that our stories are not forgotten. So I hope that's what you take away from this amazing interview. And please don't forget that you can support everything that Third State Books is doing by going to your local libraries and going to your local bookstores and asking for their titles. All right, writers, if you want even more advice, information, and inspiration for your writing life, there's only one thing you have to do, and that's go to readwriteandcreate.com. That's REED, writeandcreate.com. And that's where you'll find everything you need to optimize and enjoy your writing life. That's where you'll find our blog, show notes for this podcast, resources for your writing life, links to our monthly newsletter, links to learn more about our community for BIPOC women writers, The Sanctuary, and links to our social media handles, including links to my fun new YouTube channel. So yeah, we put it all in one spot for you. It's all at the Read, Write, and Create website, readwriteandcreate.com. Before I let you go, if you are feeling like, hey, I want to support this podcast, I love everything you're doing, Lori, well, I appreciate it. And if you want to support the podcast, 2 easy ways for you to do that. You can make a monetary donation to help defray the cost of producing this show via Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the show notes. Or you can leave me a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. The more reviews we get, the more people know how great this show is. And you know what? If you don't have the money or the time to do either of those 2 things, you can just send me some good vibes. I love good vibes, and I'll take them. Thank you. The Read, Write, and Create podcast is written and produced by me, Lori L. Tharps. Our editor is Brad Linder, and our theme music is by Wataboy. Until next week, writers, Please keep writing those stories because the world needs more BIPOC stories written by BIPOC storytellers just like you.